Hey folks, David Stewart here. Today's little mini topic, Shady 80s. If you've never heard this term before, it's probably because you are not an educator, and it's a term that educators tend to use amongst each other, particularly special educators. We don't usually use it around parents and kids for reasons that will become obvious through this video. What it refers to when we say this kid is in the Shady 80s, it's his IQ. His IQ is somewhere in the 80s. And kids who end up in the 80s as far as their IQ goes are in kind of an odd little predicament because they're too smart to qualify for most special ed services unless they have a specialized learning disability, in which case there's some kind of modification or accommodation that's done for that thing in particular. But if they just have IQ in the 80s, they don't qualify for special ed. You really have to be lower, and then you're looking at like modified curriculum or special day class or something like that to get a basic education for somebody because they have lower IQ. They're intellectually disabled or developmentally delayed or some other category that's down there. People who are in the 80s, you're not in that category, but you're also not in that broad 90 to 110 IQ range where you can be fairly successful in the academic environment. As long as your IQ is above 90, you can pretty much get through high school with decent grades. And once you get above 110, you're like way going to be pretty much past the academic pacing that's appropriate. So most kids get clustered in that middle of that bell curve from 90 to 110. That's where most people are. Once you start getting past 110, you're smarter than the usual pacing is. And then once you're below 90, you're a little bit too low for where the pacing is. So kids that are in the Shady 80s usually end up being kids who are academically unsuccessful. This is the kind of kid who will maybe get a 1.5 GPA, 1.0, and then maybe later in high school will end up failing all of his classes. And they end up kind of in a system where once we would get them in high school, we're not quite sure how to fix what's wrong because they've been failing classes for so long. They're so far behind academically that there's really not an easy way to catch them up. Not just that, but trying to catch up a student who has a little bit lower capacity is nonsense. You're asking him to be smarter than his peers, and one of the reasons he's behind his peers is because he's not as smart as them. I'm just speaking honestly as an educator here. You have a big problem when you're asking kids to catch up academically, and that you're usually asking the kids who are least capable of catching up academically to do so. So the problem is, of course, social promotion. So when a kid has a very bad year, and this tends to kick in by middle school. They start getting that 1.0 GPA. They get promoted to the next grade and sign up for the next classes anyway, but they don't have mastery of their previous academic work. And so the grades start to get worse and worse and worse because they're less and less able to keep up with the workload. They have less and less of a foundation that will support them getting through the classes. And as time has gone on, there's been this belief, this kind of tabula rasa belief, this blank slate belief in kids that basically kids all have more or less the same capacities. If you're dealing with special ed, then you know that that's not really true. Some kids have learning disabilities. Some kids are low. They need help and they need modifications. They need a different classroom environment sometimes. Not everyone's the same. That's why special ed actually exists. But in the general academic environment, there's a belief in the blank slate that any kid could be successful with Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and go on to calculus. And so what ends up happening is you get this social promotion thing, like next year he'll do better. Like somehow magically he got low grades because of who knows why he got a 1.0. The reason he got a 1.0 is that the class was moving too fast. All the classes were moving too fast for him. He needed to be in a slower academic path where he could actually master all of the material and be successful. And of course, this reinforces things with kids who are in this position where they feel like they're bad at school, so they stop trying at school. They feel like they're bad at school, they stop coming to school by high school. And then you are left with this academically unsuccessful, often delinquent student. He doesn't come to school, he ends up in a delinquent area where he's doing something in school he's not supposed to. When he's supposed to be in school, he's doing something else. And that's what they call that school to prison pipeline. It happens with a lot of kids that are in the 80s. And if you go and you look at the IQ of prisoners, that tends to be where it is. They tend to be in the shady 80s. So it's a category of kid that I just wanted to make a little video about, not because it's a term that we end up throwing around, and I'm trying to be very genteel when I talk about these terms, but it's a term that gets thrown about by educators to denote that kid who really doesn't receive any kind of help, but frankly just doesn't have the capacity to be successful with that mainstream middle of the bell curve IQ, which is where most schooling is designed for. So what if you have a kid in the shady 80s? Well, looking at other academic environments that are going to help them to learn at their own pace, or learn at a pace which is appropriate for them. That's something that just doesn't really happen in the regular public school environment. It's a one-size-fits-all and big dreams pie in the sky. Every kid's going to be successful. Every kid's going to go to college. Every kid's going to do this, because they think that these are the things which create success. If you go to college, you'll be successful. It's kind of like backwards thinking in that regard. You're not really, you're putting the cart before the horse. You think college makes people successful, rather than a category of people who are successful often go to college. It's more like a correlation of some other factor that's there, maybe high IQ or different socioeconomic status or something else that's going on there. So anyway, I want to talk about that because that's a group of kids that really get left out. The other group of kids would be the so-called gifted kids, which are going to be kids above 110 IQ who can outstrip the pacing of the basic classroom standards that exist and basically are bored in class. And so they often don't have great grades because they don't do homework or they get really bored in class. Some of you watching this, that might be you, where it's like, oh yeah, I got like a 1500 on my SATs back when it was out of 1600, so when it was just a 2-part test. So it's like, I got this really high SAT score, but I got like C's in school because I just didn't try, or it was boring, or things like that. Those are the kids who are on the other side of that, who aren't really served by public school either. So the solution, of course, is, if you have a kid and your kid is maybe in one of those areas and not outside the mainstream, a different classroom environment, homeschooling, or looking at a charter school that does something different, that's an option for a lot of parents for these kids who are maybe being a little bit left behind academically, or who are too bored in class to really be able to maximize their academic potential, let's say. So anyway, I thought I'd talk about that. Sometimes I see people online, I'm like, this guy's in the shady 80s. It's just like, he's just a little bit low to get it. If you think of that meme, the bell curve meme, the shady 80s is the guy who's on the end, who's like very obviously sees the truth. And then, you have the high IQ guy on the other side. So that's one of the problems with public schools. They really don't have a pacing option for people who are just a little bit slower than that middle cluster in the average. Anyway, so I thought I'd talk about that. Leave me your thoughts down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a great one.